hearing more about that topic. So we invited her back for the last one. So I'm super excited to hear what she has to say. So I will, with no further ado, introduce Andrea Barra.
Myself. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I'm so glad to see you all back, and to be invited back again was very cool. So yeah, we didn't. It was one of the actually topics that I wanted to talk about when we first got together in November, but since I had so much else to talk about, I of course did not get to it. So I'm glad that we'll have the time to kind of expand on this a little bit and do a little bit more of a deep dive into it. The one thing that I'll say, and I was kind of explaining this a little bit before everybody jumped on, was that this is more of a, there are more data in this presentation than I normally give in a lot of presentations, because I think that on this topic, especially, numbers are really important because they're incredibly illuminating in terms of thinking about the criminal justice system and our perceptions of crime and criminals and things of that nature, and our understanding, our sort of general understanding of what race looks like in the criminal justice system, which I'm going to assume that we all have a pretty similar base understanding of what that means. But the numbers give it even more magnitude than we even, I think, kind of commonly consider. So I wanted to make sure that this was hopefully a good balance between being number and data heavy and sort of analysis driven as well. So that's just my little caveat. So I will share my screen because I'm very PowerPointy, sorry. I know some people don't love the PowerPoint, but I love the PowerPoint. So I am going to share this with you. And there we go. We can see that. Good. Perfect. So yeah, so we're gonna just I'm gonna kind of clue you into how I'm gonna organize this talk, but I wanted to first give some information to sort of set the scene of what we're talking about here when we talk about generally our criminal justice system and kind of what we mean by that. So, and just to let you know, for those of you who care about that sort of thing, there will be a lot of, I didn't bother to cite everything from where I found it within the slides, but I have a long list of resources and information that you can kind of re-reference when you, if you want to later on in the presentation, but pretty much everything that I'm going to give you today, facts and figure-wise, unless quoted differently, will all be listed at the end. So, so just some general thoughts about jails and prison, just to kind of get us started off with. Some of these you've probably heard before, but just to refresh your memory, the United States has 5% of the world's population and nearly 25% of its incarcerated population. We love putting people in jail. So we spend approximately $87 billion as of 2015, $87 billion on jails and prisons. And that is, up thousands and thousands of percents from even 4 years ago. So we are spending tons of money, not just on police, but on prisons as well. In 1972, there were 200,000 people incarcerated in the United States, and today that number is 2.2 million. Now, of course, our population has also grown since that time, but you can guess, if you know anything about numbers, that the population has not grown at the same rate that the prison population has grown. And an interesting sort of underthought about statistic, and we won't have, unfortunately, a time really today to go into gender implications of the criminal justice system, but from 1980 to 2017, the number of women in jails and prisons in the US grew over 750%. That's huge. So there's a lot of things to be thinking about here in terms of moving parts in the criminal justice system, of course, but we're just focusing on incarceration right now. Interestingly, some good news. In 2017, there were It's not good news that there were 43,580 youths in juvenile detention centers. However, that's half as many as there were 10 years previous. Now, there's probably a lot of reasons for this, but the youth prison population has dropped. That's a good thing. Also a good thing, from 2005 to 2019, the overall number of violent victimization fell 16% overall in the United States and 32% for Blacks in particular. So we're seeing, this is when people talk about crime dropping and there's less crime, violent victimization, especially, right, people who are victims of violent crimes, those numbers are down significantly over sort of the early 2000s until now. However, at the same time, or approximately the same time, from 1997 to 2016, law enforcement grew by almost 53,000 officers, from a rate of 2.4 to 2.17 officers per citizen. Just think about that for a second. There are 2.17 officers per citizen, right? That's crazy talk. The other way around, sorry, citizens per officer, sorry. So for each of us, there are, there are two and a half of us, right? There is at least one law enforcement officer. In 2018, also bad news, Blacks and Hispanics were more likely than whites or persons of other races to experience at least one type of force during their most recent contact with police. Now, this is either a initiated or uninitiated contact with the police. So Blacks and Hispanics, 5% of them said that in any contact that they had with police, now this can be anything from a crime occurring, from them calling the police for a crime, for a traffic accident, any kind of contact with police, that 5% of them responded that they experienced some kind of force during contact with police. So just setting the scene a little bit. The most important thing, the most important piece of data to think about right now, however, is this chart by the Prison Policy Initiative. And this is 2010 because obviously it's based on census, the most recent census data, which are still 2010. But this is the number of people incarcerated by 100,000. So just the dramatic, I mean, I don't even have to say anything about this chart. You can just look at this chart, and the drama of the bar chart itself kind of speaks for what it is. But so per every 100,000 people in a category, 2,306 of them, black folks, are incarcerated per every 100,000. That's nuts. Look at the white rate is 450. So you're looking at, almost 5 times as many. 4.5 times as many, right? So this is what, and interestingly enough, it was interesting to me, certainly, that the next highest group is American Indian or Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, then Latinx, and then Asians in the smallest group. So this is kind of what we're dealing with, I would say, to foreground this whole conversation, because of course incarceration is the very last step in this very long journey that we're going to go through in the criminal justice system. But keep this in mind. Obviously, rates are important because they even out populations. But the other thing to just always keep in the back of your mind when we're having this conversation also is that Black people make up approximately 13% of the population in the United States. You probably know that number, but definitely keep that number in the back of your mind, because when we talk about the percentage of Black people in X category or Y category, I want you to always think about that in relation to their proportion in the population, right? Because that's how we sort of understand inequality, is understanding that if all else were equal, right, the percentage of people in a certain category would be represented in every category, right? So if Black people make up 13% of the population, they should be, in theory, if all else were equal, 13% of the incarcerated population. Obviously, from this chart, you can tell that that is not the case. So, a couple more statistics for you. I'll go through these a little bit quickly, because I'll share these slides and you can, mull over these data if you want for a little bit longer. Black people are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate of 5.1 times the imprisonment of whites. In 5 states, that disparity is more than 10 to 1. In 12 states, more than half of people in jails and prisons and state prisons are Black. In Maryland, it's 72%. 72%. In 11 states, at least 1 in 20 adult Black males is in prison. And in Oklahoma, which has the highest overall Black incarceration rate, 1 in 15 Black males ages 18 and over is in prison. And Latinos are in prison at a rate that is approximately 1.4 times the rate of whites. So also very high. And then the very last one, this will also probably not come as much of a surprise to you, but 38% of whites versus 89% of Blacks viewed the criminal justice system as biased against Blacks. Not a surprise, but obviously the difference in percentage is what's important here. 8% of Blacks and 56% of whites saw the criminal justice system as treating Blacks fairly. 8% of Black people believe that the criminal justice system is fair. 8%, whereas it's over half of white folks. And 68% of whites and only 18% of Blacks expressed confidence in law enforcement. And this was 2011, so I'm guessing these numbers are probably even lower now for Black people. I'm not sure how much the needle has changed for white folks. I would hope more, given a lot of the exposure that we've had over the last few years in terms of law enforcement, but they would have to redo that study just to see. All right, so the way I'm going to kind of organize this, and the way a lot of this was taught to me certainly, was to think about racism in the criminal justice system as an accumulation along the way. So there's not one point in the system where we can say, this is where racism happens, right? There is every point in the criminal justice system where we talk about the accumulation of sort of racial injustice piece by piece by piece as we go through the system. Now, again, lots of people have interactions with the criminal justice system. They may, sort of start and stop at number 1. They may get to, number 2 or number 3 and then stop, right? So a lot of this is dependent on sort of where you enter the system, who you are, and then every decision that gets made along the way. And the reason why decision is sort of an important word here is because we have to remember that a lot of this stuff is really subjective. So we tend to think about crime, I think, in a very objective way, right? A crime has occurred. Police investigate a crime. A person is found, is found to have committed that crime. A person goes to trial. A trial decides whether or not that person is innocent or guilty. And then if that person is guilty, they are incarcerated, right? We sort of divorce the humanity and the subjectivity out of the criminal justice system as though there is a very objective answer to crime and whether or not crime has occurred. So I want you to be very conscious of the idea of decision, because there are human actors at every single point and every single step in the criminal justice system. And human actors are humans, that's the most important part. And they are, influenced by culture and influenced by the country that we live in and the systems that we live under and white supremacy, et cetera. So just keep in mind that this is so many of these steps have to do with individual people making decisions step by step. So these are the steps in the system. We're going to go through them, and we're going to look at how race and race effects accumulate in each step of the system until the end, in order to get to that chart we saw at the beginning, right? The end point, which is the incarceration rates, right? Which, again, if you were to just look at that chart, looks objective, right? There are this many people who are incarcerated, which means there are this many people who are criminals, right? And with sort of no consideration of what's in between. So let's look at the what's in between. So the very first step, obviously, in the criminal justice system is, has a crime occurred, right? We start from the very beginning. Has a crime occurred? How do we find out if crimes have occurred? Well, a lot of times we find out crimes have occurred because there is some sort of, either someone alerts the police see something, someone is indicated in some kind of crime happening. So the first thing we have to from the very beginning, the very first thing we have to stop and look at is, right, who is stopped, who is searched, and where do we see very high police presence, right? So we tend to see these sorts of things in lower class and minority neighborhoods, right? Very highly policed, whether that's even starting in, with police presence in schools, police sort of, cruising neighborhoods, right? Where are these, where is detection most likely to happen, right? And so we think about policies like stop and frisk. So I was living in New York City when stop and frisk was kind of at its height. And the idea of, who gets stopped, obviously, right? Who's the stopped part of stop and frisk, right? And then if a group of people are stopped at a much higher rate and frisked at a much higher rate, of course, you're more likely to find something amongst them, right? Than you are if you don't stop people. If people are never stopped, then they're never frisked, and then crimes are not found, right? Especially drugs and weapons, things of that nature that are sort of easily concealed on a person that are technically crimes, but that are not active crimes that are being committed. And then our favorite phrase, driving while Black, which, if you know any Black people, will tell you is an absolutely valid and true thing that happens. Racial profiling happens in traffic arrests. We absolutely know this. And so if someone is stopped for a traffic incident and they are somehow searched, of course, they're more likely to find things that they're not supposed to find while that happens. If I am, driving up and down what they call the drug corridor of I-95 from Florida up to New York, as a white woman, I'm probably much, much more likely going to be getting away with driving drugs up and down the coast of the United States than if I were not a white woman. So more you're stopped, the more bad things are going to be found. Right? And we see this especially, the example I often use for students, kind of tying into this war on drugs issue is, I would talk to all of them about, who did drugs in high school, right? So who smoked pot in high school, right? You all know that's illegal, you all did that, but where were you doing that? Were you doing that out on the street corner, or were you doing that in your nice suburban, house, backyard, up in your bedroom where no one was ever, no one except maybe your parents was ever going to find you, right? So while the incidence of drugs, which is a crime, of course, is the same as has been found through many studies amongst all groups of people. Right? Certain groups of people are obviously found to be drug users at a higher rate because of how they're stopped and because of the sort of out in the openness of the use, as opposed to in private homes and places. So, of course, the war on drugs, we know this has been an incredibly polarizing issue ever since the 80s, and so we start to see these, much more racial perceptions of drug use, right? Who is the crack smoker? Who is the cocaine snorter? What does that look like, right? If I say those two things to you, you conjure up two images pretty quickly in your mind, and I won't call you out about what's going on in your brain, but I can probably guess, especially in the 80s, what your perception of those two things might be, right? So even the idea of drug use becomes incredibly racialized, and white hippies smoking pot and Black teenagers smoking pot are two very different things, despite the fact that they're exactly the same thing, right? So this also had a huge influence on where law enforcement resources were deployed. The idea of sort of raiding crack houses and things of that. Nobody ever raided high-end nightclubs where most of the cocaine was being used in back rooms, right? They raided, inner city abandoned houses that had, folks who were using drugs in them. So there's been, this very large divide in how we look at the war on drugs and why the war on drugs was perpetuated and who, of course, was the target of the war on drugs. The other thing that's really important here is and I should have said this from the beginning, most of the time when we think about crime, we almost exclusively think about street crime, right? Street crime, property and personal crime. So we think about things like murder, rape, burglary, robbery, auto theft, things of that nature, right? But really, when we look at obviously other types of crime, there are lots of other types of crimes, especially white collar crime. And we think about the difference in that, and we think about the difference in who commits those types of crimes. What do we value, right? White collar crime is a crime, but a lot of time we think about white collar crime as being really awfully entrepreneurial, right? And there's such a thin line between, learning how to game the system and it actually being a crime, right? So there is this kind of dichotomy between what we really see as sort of, crimes with victims or victimization crimes, and these sort of more, money crimes or business crimes or whatever else you want to call white collar crime. And also, street crime is a lot easier to find. If someone steals your car, that's a lot easier to prove than, insider stock trading and, Ponzi schemes and things of this nature, right? Street crime is much more straightforward. It's much more objective. This thing happened, and it's easier to find. I don't need a forensic accountant to figure out whether or not my house has been robbed, right? Burgled. I never remember the difference between robbery and burglary. That's terrible. Burglary is property, robbery is person. Anyway, always get those mixed up. It's like jail and prison, which I still, even after all these years, use interchangeably, even though I know better. And also, we're not scared of white collar crime, right? We see white collar crime as not really having victims. It's, it's money, which is important to us, but we have so much more of a great fear of street crime and so much more of a public awareness of street crime. It is incredibly sensationalized. We see it everywhere. We make movies about it. We make television shows about it. I mean, how long has Law and Order been running on television, and in how many iterations has Law and Order been running on television, right? We think that we know what crime looks like. We think that we know how crime is dealt with, right? I mean, I could, probably, and I think someone has done a dissertation on, the CSI effect on forensics and trials and all of this, right? So we're incredibly influenced by media, as we all know. And so we have this, even in times like now, where street crime is falling, where there are objectively not as many crimes occurring as there have in past years, we still have an incredible fear of street crime. And so that leads to this need for, for street crime to be punished and to be detected. So, and also in, media hype, even if we're talking about news media. So, I mean, even put fictionalized media aside, but thinking about news media, what do we see at the beginning of every nightly news show? And unless something, major has happened in the world, at the beginning of any nightly news show, the very first thing you're generally going to see is somebody got shot. There was a string of carjackings, there was, whatever it might be that's crime related. The if it bleeds, it leads school of thinking in media, right? Which I don't know where that comes from. It's terrible that I don't know that, but that's a quote. I'm sure you've heard it before. But about sort of local news media, those are always first. So that's our first, think about that being your first impression pretty much every night. If you watch media, you of course think that street crime is a really big problem, because at least something horrific has happened every single day for them to lead your local news with. Street crime is terrible. And then also when we start to get into, the more racial aspects of it, and this has come up a lot recently in some of in the Capitol riots, but in many, in many of the school shootings and the kid in Michigan who shot at the protest, went across state lines. I can't remember his name. I don't even want to say his name, but you know who I'm talking about. And so this idea of, if it's a Black perpetrator, you're going to get a mugshot, right? So-and-so has been arrested. Here's the mugshot. This is the criminal. This is who they are. versus when you often get these white perpetrators and you get, you know, their graduation photo, or, you know, their, you know, them with their, you know, with their best friend out in there, you know, and you don't get their mugshot. You see them as human, you see them as a person. And Black perpetrators, you see them as a criminal, right? So that's a huge difference in perception. If you're always seeing that same thing over and over again, you see photos of Black people, but they're always mugshots, right? That's a really different perception than the kind of humanizing that tends to happen with white perpetrators. You know, Dylan Roof in South Carolina is the kind of quintessential example of that, right? And his little bowl cut, you know, you didn't get a mugshot of that guy. You got, oh, you know, poor little white boy narrative. So, sorry, I talk really fast. I have so much to get through. So let's say objectively the crime has occurred, right? So the crime has occurred. The police arrive on the scene. What happens next, right? So we get into this this is the first really obvious place in which human actors become very, very important, right? So police are interacting with someone who they believe has committed a crime, or someone who knows something about a crime that's been committed, and they make a lot of decisions, and they are allowed to have a lot of discretion. And how do we know that? Even if you've never been involved in a crime and you've never been questioned about a crime, I can give you the example that will always make sense to everyone, which is everyone's been pulled over driving, I would assume at some point or another. If you've managed not to, good for you, but pretty much everybody's been pulled over. Now, you know, there are times that you've gotten a ticket, and there are times when the officer has said, make sure you slow down, and waved you on your way. Now, maybe there were some mitigating circumstances that were different from one time to the other, but most of the time, you're either benefiting from or or not benefiting from a police officer's complete discretion as to whether or not to ticket you and to make what you did a crime. So think about that when you're thinking about police discretion in any time that they have an interaction with the public. So their expectation about behavior and about motivation makes a huge difference, not only in how they interact, but in what they're even looking for. So of course, there are stereotypes. And of course, we live in a society where we have been inundated with stereotypes for our entire lives. And whether we believe that we are, good, non-prejudiced people, we live in a racist society. And so there are not always ways we can get out of having those stereotypes and having those presumptions. So there is a presumption of guilt very often that happens, with police, depending on who they're confronting, depending on the location that something has happened, the age of the perpetrator, whether they are, familiar with the neighborhood, any of those kinds of things, there is often a presumption of guilt. And, the other issue of, what does it mean to be respectful, right? We have this conversation a lot, and you will hear from Black families the idea of having the talk, right? And it's not the sex talk like the rest of us have had with our parents, it's the police talk. It's the, if you get pulled over or if you're stopped and questioned by a police officer, how do you act towards them, right? You are non-threatening. You say yes, sir, and no, sir. You keep your hands out, right? These are conversations that Black families have because they understand this idea of, being respectful towards police is incredibly important, because police officers are often sort of, they have an understanding of behavior towards them in particular ways, and those ways are often very racialized. So they are looking for things, more from certain folks than they aren't. And this is not to, let me preface all of this by saying, this is not police bashing. This is not me saying all officers are inherently terribly racist people, but they work within a racist system. And it is very difficult to often think outside of that, or, you know, when you have things like quotas and, you know, you have a certain amount of arrests that you're supposed to make, and that is still a thing in certain police precincts and departments. So the police are going to be, you know, looking, and they're going to be making, you know, some assumptions, whether they like it or not, or whether they're doing it consciously or not. And so then we get to sort of the second part of police discretion, which is sort of what the interaction is going to look like. Is it going to be just a respectful interaction? Is it going to be a, hey, we have to take you in for questioning kind of interaction? Or is there going to be force involved? Unfortunately, we know that police brutality exists. And we know that there is, I don't want to say often, but there are definitely instances in which force is used against folks, rightfully or not rightfully. That is not for me to say. But the existence of force being used is something that has been studied and something that we know obviously occurs. It is true, although probably over-exaggerated, that less educated officers tend to be the most aggressive and have the most formal complaints filed against them when compared to more educated counterparts. But that's, I think, probably a statistic that gets overblown a little bit. There is often an experience gap that might be more important, maybe more than an education gap. But there are a lot of factors that that contribute to, you know, to contribute to whether or not force is used and how often force is used. So, you know, we think back to, and I probably don't have to tell most of you, but usually when I teach students, especially when they're younger, and they were not alive when Rodney King happened. We have to remind them of that incident in United States history. But the idea that sort of Rodney King and his assault was the first time that we really had kind of a national conversation about police brutality, which is why I call it the discovery of police brutality. Obviously, people know that there has been police brutality for quite a long time, especially Black people know that that is true. But it really was the first, because of the riots that it sparked. It really was kind of the first big national conversation we had about police brutality. And thinking about it now, I don't mean this to be facetious, but Rodney King was kind of quaint, considering some of the use of force cases that we've seen in the intervening years. But of course, it being on tape and then the officers being acquitted is something that we can relate to a little bit more closely even in these days, while watching officers not have consequences for excessive use of force and for police shootings. And I wanted to address something that often comes up from students, which is why are officers of color, but especially Black officers, why do they use brutality, and why are they, why do they sort of buy into the same stereotypes and ideas about criminals, and and all of this? They're Black, they should know that not all Black folks are like this, et cetera, et cetera. And so I really liked this quote that it's a little bit long, but I think it's important to think about. So, police are an extension of white supremacy in the field. Accordingly, it should not come as a surprise that increases in police sensitivity training, higher educational requirements for officer recruits, community policing, and other progressive approaches have not produced a measurable decrease in police brutality against Black males, because none of these initiatives specifically address the large societal issues of police brutality and white supremacy, of which police are an extension. So the idea that, we all get socialized into systems, right? And so Black officers are socialized into the same systems that white officers are socialized into. And so the ideas of sort of peer expectations, and also in some senses, a lot of internalized prejudice that, that is just part of the system, right? So if you are in a job where you see, crime and criminals every single day, and you continue to get this same profile, in your head every single day of what a criminal is and what a criminal looks like, and all of this, it doesn't matter who you are, what your characteristics are, you're receiving the same messages over and over again. And so you begin to get socialized into this same institution, which tells you that this is what criminals look like, and these people are criminals. And so that is, that's what you're there to fight against. That's what you're there to, to stop. So obviously that's not the same for everyone, but I often see this question come up when you look at some of these either shootings or police brutality cases, and they'll do the little array of officers, and it'll be like 4 white officers and then a black officer, and people are always like, what about the black cop? It's like, well, they're part of the system as well, and the white supremacy that is sort of overarching in our culture is overarching for everyone, right? You don't escape it if you're not white, even the negative parts of it, the negative ideals of it, if that makes sense. And then, of course, we kind of can't get around this topic without talking about shootings, police shootings, since that has become such a sort of prevalent discussion and conversation in our society over the past, let's say, 5 to 10 years. This is all from and I have the link at the end, but the Washington Post has done a fatal force database since 2015, and they have recorded every fatal police involved shooting that they can find. And I mean, they scour every local news. So a lot of them are ones that aren't sort of in official databases and things elsewhere, but they have found them all through kind of media and through other places. And so they record that there have been almost 6,000 fatal shootings since 2015. That's a lot. I did the math on that quickly, and that's about 3 every day over the course of 5 years. So that's pretty nuts. And if you saw, there was just a report that came out today on NPR, and I think that they're using very similar statistics, because I saw this number. They had the exact same number as the Post did, is that they came up with the number of 135 unarmed Black people, confirmed unarmed, absolutely without a gun, a knife, a car, anything that can be considered, being armed. 135 of those were unarmed Black people. We had 205 fatal shootings in Georgia, where I looked at it really quickly, I don't remember exactly where we are, but we're definitely in the top 10 of states. So yay for us. I mean, we are also the 8th most populous state, so you would expect our numbers would be large, but 205. And then most shocking to me was that there were almost 1,400 that involved people with known mental illness, many others which could have also involved folks with mental illness, but almost 1,400 that they can confirm that mental illness was some kind of a factor in the shooting. So that was pretty eye-opening to me. I don't know about the rest of you, but not surprisingly, Black people are killed at a rate at more than twice the rate of whites, so 34 versus 14 per million, and Hispanics right there in the middle at 26 per million. And interestingly, this one surprised me as well, data that surprised me. States with the highest rate of shootings are New Mexico, Alaska, and Oklahoma. I don't know why that surprised me, but those were probably not the 3 states I would have put up as the top 3 states with the highest rate of shootings. They have smaller populations, so obviously rate then becomes a little bit more of a comparison point. But anyway, that's just something I thought was kind of interesting. So, this is obviously clearly an issue. We know that this is an issue, but looking at the numbers, I thought was even more illuminating than I had expected. So I had a love-hate relationship with this quote, but I had to put it in here. So from our esteemed ex-personal lawyer to our ex-president, Rudy Giuliani. Again, I used to live in New York City, so I have a weird relationship with Rudy Giuliani, but he said, quote, "If you want to deal with this on the Black side, you've got to teach your children to be respectful to the police, and you've got to teach your children that the real danger to them is not the police. the real danger to them 99 out of 100 times, 9,900 out of 10,000 times are other Black kids who are going to kill them. That's the way they're going to die. So he said this on, I believe, a national news program. And the reason I included it is because I think this is a really common perception. I think that this is a really, really common argument that people have, right? And I have heard this 100 times, and I'm sure you all have too, right? Every time somebody gets shot by a police officer, the discourse is, what did they do? Why were they reaching for something? Why did they give the police any reason to think that they were a danger, et cetera, right? These are the conversations that we have every time that there's a shooting. And it was so sort of blatant the way that he said it. And it also adds to the Black on Black crime stereotype, which is also a stereotype and not also borne out by data in particular. So anyway, I just thought I would include that in there just to get your blood boiling halfway through the presentation. So, so the very last part of police discretion is, of course, the idea that there are, institutional efforts to not punish or sanction officers who use brutality, who are involved in shootings. It's very hard, as we know, to get officers fired. It's certainly near to impossible to get them tried or convicted, or to be, sort of pushed further through the criminal justice system at all. Right? The great blue wall of silence. And that, nearly all of the time, shootings are found to be justifiable. It is very hard to prove that an officer was not in fear of their life. If they say they were in fear of their life, how do you say that they were not? It's very hard to prove that. And, most prosecutors' offices do not want the bad PR of being the ones who put law enforcement officers through trials and try to find them guilty. The police and the prosecutors have a very close working relationship, and they need to keep that as amiable as possible. And so it's a very tough step to try to push that forward. And we do find that a large percentage of misconduct is repeat offenders. So a large percentage of police brutality and police shootings are people who have multiple offenses against them. And even when that happens, there is, a huge reluctance towards, again, sanctioning them, firing them, trying to get them help to, improve their understanding or to improve their behavior, responses, whatever. And this is where you get that, there's just some bad apples kind of explanation of police, which, maybe if something was being done about the bad apples, I could buy that explanation a little bit better. I don't think that's the explanation, but, you can't say there are just some bad apples and then keep the bad apples in the barrel with the rest of them. That makes all the apples bad, to extend a very poor metaphor even further. So, all right, so some kind of crime, we have detected some kind of crime, the police have gotten involved, and they have made a decision as to whether or not they're going to arrest you. So they have decided, yes, I'm going to arrest you. I believe you have committed X crime. Here we go. So I'm going to put you in jail. Jail is the local one. Prison's the big one. Again, still something that I mess up. So, you know what bail is. I don't have to tell you what it is, but right, it's money that they, that they hold to ensure that you show up for trial. So you're accused of this. You've got to go to trial. You're out on however much bail. Obviously, whenever there's money involved, it's going to be discriminatory on class lines, which then makes it consequently discriminatory on racial lines. Not always, but often. And the idea that, depending on what the crime is, depending on, what the circumstances are, high bail can be and often is, used to keep folks in jail and, basically hoping that they're going to break down because nobody wants to be in jail. So they're going to break down and plea, or sort of move forward. And this was a fact that I didn't know until more recently, but median bail for felonies, and again, remember, things can be felonies that are not what we would consider to be super serious crimes, but median bail for felonies is $10,000, which is approximately 8 months income for the typical person being held for a felony. So that's a lot of money. Even if you only need a tenth of that in order to be released on bail, that's still $1,000, which most folks don't just kind of have hanging around to be let out. So we see people, stuck in jail for long periods of time. And also, unlike television shows, we don't generally turn around and have trials 3 days later, like they always do in TV shows. You ever notice that? Somebody gets arrested and like 2 days later, they're in court for trial. It's definitely not how it happens. It's more like a year at least, if you're lucky, right? So if you can't be out on bail and you want to go to trial, you are basically sitting around languishing in jail, whether you like it or not. So this is one of the first causes, we talk about mass incarceration, this is one of the first causes of mass incarceration is bail, which again, some of these are things I've learned about much more recently. At any time, approximately 500,000 non-convicted people, not convicted, haven't been convicted of a crime, have been accused of a crime but not convicted of it, are in local jails. 500,000 at any point in time. That is a crazy number, right? So these are basically people who can't go out, who can't afford bail or have been denied bail. And they are sitting in local jails waiting to go to trial, right? So bail in a lot of cases, in most cases, is super arbitrary. Also, again, human actors and their decisions. So there really aren't very consistent rules. Judges can completely decide whether or not they're going to set bail, how high the bail is going to be, whether bail is required at all, right? If they'll release people to families or what have you. And so this is another instance in which an individual actor, with all the individual thoughts and ideas and prejudices that individuals have, makes decisions about what happens next in the process. So I screen capped this tweet that I saw from a couple days ago, which I thought was a nice, very stark comparison of the idea of bail. So Khalif Browder, who sort of unfortunately, very famously, allegedly, because we don't know if he did or not, allegedly stole a backpack at the age of 16. The general consensus is that he did not. And he spent 3 years in Rikers waiting for a trial because they couldn't afford the bail. The bail on him was so high, his family couldn't afford the bail. And subsequently, he was released and died by suicide, if you know the rest of the story about Khalif Browder, because he was also basically in solitary for most of the time that he was in Rikers, which also is an adult prison when he was 16. So compound all of these things. And then our smiling white girl here on the right, who stole the laptop from Nancy Pelosi's office and apparently tried to sell it to the Russians. I don't know how true that is, but she certainly was part of the Capitol riot and stole property from a US congressperson. And she was released to her mother and did not have to spend a single moment in jail. So, you know how it is. So bail happens or it doesn't happen. So you're either sitting in jail or you're sitting at home waiting for your trial. And we get to step 4, which is pressing charges. So another place where we have humans making decisions. So this is pressing charges is a joint decision between the police and the prosecutor's office. They decide what to charge on, if they're going to charge at all, if they're going to just drop the charges, etc. They also decide in which court charges are going to go forward. So speaking of Khalif Browder being 16 years old, technically he is a youth, and probably for something like stealing a backpack, even if he had done it, should have, gone to a youth detention center and, served his time and, and been done with it. But, minorities by much higher rates are more likely to go to adult court and to be treated as adults, and also at far younger ages than white youths. So they're far more likely to send, 14, 15-year-old Black children to adult court than they are to, and maybe they'll send a 16 or 17-year-old white child to adult court, depending on the severity. But more often than not, it's this idea of Black children, especially Black male children, don't get to be children, right? Tamir Rice, 12 years old with his toy gun getting shot, right? So it's the same idea, right? The viewing of Black children as more adult-like. And then, the idea of civil versus criminal court, right? I won't get into that a ton, but again, this sort of white collar street crime dichotomy and where all that gets dealt with. The really important thing here is this last bullet, which is called overcharging. So because the police and the prosecutor's office get to decide what charges are going to be and whether they're going to press charges, they also get to decide kind of what the litany of those charges are. And what often happens is, if it's something like, auto theft or something, right? You would think, all right, it's auto theft, the end, felony car theft, the end. But they can add things like resisting arrest, right? That's the huge one that always, kind of gets added on, right? The officer says, well, this person was X, Y, and Z when I tried to arrest them. So they add resisting arrest. They then might add on additional felonies or misdemeanors depending on what was in the car and how much, property damage there was in the car, and on and on and on. It doesn't tend to be a simple, we're going to either charge for this or we're going to not charge for this. So the more they add on charges, the more obviously likely you are to be guilty of something, right? And that decision to prosecute, leads to all of these consequences. Again, whether you're sitting in jail awaiting bail, you're going to lose your job. If you have children, you could lose your children, of course, if you were, in jail and no one can take care of them. You are sort of, branded a criminal by community, all of these, things. But here's the thing that blew my mind when I learned it more than anything else I think that I've learned about the criminal justice system. And maybe you all knew this and I was very ignorant, but approximately 94% of state cases and 97% of federal cases plead out before they ever make it to trial. Again, maybe it's too much media, but I have always just had this idea that people who are accused of crime, go through a trial, right? I knew you could plead guilty, but I was so unaware of how big those numbers were. And so lots of people accept pleas, even in the case of innocence, because it does often tend to get you a shorter sentence. You're not taking a chance on a jury. You already know what the outcome's going to be, because if they're going to plead you to 2 years or whatever, if you go to trial, you could potentially get 10 years. So isn't it a better bargain to take 2 years than it is to possibly gamble for 10 years? And that's kind of how they get you. And also, or sometimes it can just be, you get to go home, but you've still committed a crime, which means you still have all of the consequences of committing a crime that go along with it, including job consequences and housing consequences, especially if felonies are involved, right? So there's a, sort of a gamble, especially with people who are more precarious and don't have the resources to, to fight these kinds of things at trial, to just say, okay, fine, I can do a year, I'll do a year. But then you're still under the system, then you're on probation or parole, or, you're still a part of the system. And lots of people, even innocent people, will take pleas just because the gamble is too great to go to trial. And this is the second cause of mass incarceration, right? Is the not necessarily innocence, but the, the taking of some kind of time to avoid the gamble of trial. Then we get to trials and convictions. I'm so conscious of the time. I'm so sorry. I knew I was going to go over. So as we know, of course, legal representation can be very uneven. So fine, you've made it to trial. You've said, no, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to go to trial. Then you have to worry about who's representing you. Of course, based on what you can afford. We all know that lawyers are very expensive. Some public defender facts that I found very interesting. 957 public defenders' offices received more than 5.5 million indigent defense cases in 2007. That's mind-boggling. So in the United States, there are about 15,000 full-time public defenders. Again, this is 2007. These numbers might be a little different, but you can guess that the rate is still pretty similar. But those who have state-based public defenders' offices had each full-time attorney had a median of 82 felony and 217 new misdemeanor cases a year. A year. There's not enough hours in the day for that, right? So you're looking at people who are overburdened, a system that's overburdened. So how you can expect to get any kind of really good legal representation, and not to say that public defenders aren't amazing, because they are amazing, but they work in an incredibly overburdened system, and that's just the way that it works. So you get to your trial. Here's the problem though. Oftentimes when you're overcharged, it's going to lead to a greater likelihood of you getting incarcerated for something, because juries very often sort of, again, because of our inculcation of what we understand about the criminal justice system, you must be guilty of something, right? If you've gotten to trial and you've gotten this far in the system, you've got to be guilty of something. So juries, even if they don't necessarily maybe feel like you're, guilty of the whole thing, or they're not convinced that you are guilty of, a very serious charge, they want to convict you for something. So they will often convict of some of the lesser charges, which if you didn't have multiple charges against you, they wouldn't have anything else to convict you of. Bias is huge in jury decisions, much more likely than with judge decisions. That's why people oftentimes choose to go for bench trials rather than jury trials. If you have that decision to make, they're often minorities are hugely underrepresented on juries. We see that a lot. You see lots of Black men being convicted by 12 white people juries, or maybe 11 white people and maybe one Black person, or one person of color on the jury. But the problem is it's very hard to prove, because lawyers can dismiss jurors for all kinds of reasons. They can not like the way your hair looks and dismiss you. And so it's really hard to prove that, potential jurors are being dismissed because one side or the other is trying to sort of racially purify the jury. If you want to look at an amazing, I say amazing in a unbelieving kind of way, look at the case of Curtis Flowers in Alabama, who was just recently exonerated and let out of prison after being tried 6 times by the same district attorney in Alabama. Oh shoot, was it Mississippi? I think it was Mississippi, sorry. Let's get those 2 states confused, that's terrible. Anyway, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and basically the district attorney was found to have dismissed potential jurors for racial reasons several times by the Mississippi State Supreme Court, and he was finally released after 24 years in prison, something like that. So it's a fascinating. There was a whole podcast series on it. I highly recommend it if you're interested in some of these issues, because they really delve quite well into a lot of these issues. I will find out I'll remind myself what it's called later if you're interested. All right, so you've gone through your trial, you've been found guilty. Now what happens? So you're even sentencing in all of the studies that have been done on sentencing. Sentencing is still disproportionately severe for minority defendants, even when you control for things that you would think you would control for, like how serious was the crime and what is the prior record of the person who is on trial, still tend to get more severe penalties for minority defendants. There's a hugely disproportionate number of minorities, include all types of minorities, race, class, and mental ability on death row. I'll talk about in a second. Also, there is a lot of discrimination in mandatory minimum laws. The sort of classic example, which I used a little bit earlier, is this crack versus cocaine mandatory minimums. So there are much lower mandatory minimum years of mandatory minimums for cocaine use and possession and distribution than there is for crack. And again, this is a very racialized law under the assumption that cocaine is more of a middle upper class white person drug, and crack is more of a lower class Black person drug. And so the years attached to a crack conviction are much higher than for that of a cocaine conviction. So quick note on the death penalty. 42% of death row inmates are Black, and they make up 34% of those who are eventually executed. Here's the one that really brings it home to you. Between 1976 and 2014, defendants convicted of killing white people were over 4 times more likely to be executed than those convicted of killing Black people. So the race of the victim, and we actually see this in sentencing other than just the death penalty, but it's very stark in death penalty cases. But the race of the victim often leads to either harsher or less harsh sentences, depending. And that actually is absent of the race of the defendant. A white person would get more time for killing another white person than they would get for killing a Black person, and the same for Black defendants. So, and then just to sort of put a point on it, there was a Supreme Court case in 1987 out of Georgia, and the court refused to reverse a death sentence because it concluded that racial bias in sentencing is, quote, an inevitable part of our criminal justice system. I could have probably not given this entire talk and just told you that one quote, and it would have summed all of this up really, really nicely. Apparently it is. So racial bias is just an inevitable part of our system. The end. A quick note on exonerations, which is my personal sort of pet area of interest. 60% of DNA exonerations since 1989 were Black defendants. Again, more likely to be wrongly convicted when the victim was white. 15% of murders convicted by Black individuals had white victims, but 31% of wrongfully convicted Black defendants had white victims. So we're more quick to judgment on on crimes with white victims. 49% of total exonerations, so even beyond DNA exonerations for all reasons, were Black, 36% were white, and 12% were Hispanic. And then just if you're interested in this, in case you wanted to know what the leading causes of exonerations are, some of them tied to race, some of them obviously not tied to race, but false confessions, misidentification, bad forensic evidence, perjury, and then police or prosecutor misconduct. So mistaken identity is definitely a race issue. There are many studies on cross-racial identification and how bad all of us are across races at properly identifying people of other races. So it's much stronger to have a witness of the same race as a possible defendant, because, for instance, white people are better at identifying other white people than they are at identifying people of other races, and vice versa. So that is often a case of racial issue in exonerations, and false accusations can be as well. So anyway, that's just some kind of interesting extra data for you there. Here's what I promised. Here are a bunch of really good sites. This is where I got almost all of my data from, again, unless otherwise noted. But there are just some really good statistics here. Of course, EJI, as Claire was talking about earlier, Brian Stevenson's organization is incredible and has a lot of really, really good information. That Fatal Force database is where I got all the police shootings. You can scroll through their database. You can go by state. You can go by race, by age, whether somebody was armed, mental illness, etc. I got lost in it for hours when I was putting this together. The National Registration of Exonerations lists every single case of exoneration since 1989 and the circumstances surrounding it, which is also really interesting. Prison Policy Initiative, the Sentencing Project, and get a lot of the police information, law enforcement information from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which keeps really good information on police and prisons. Whew, sorry that was so fast. Sorry I went over. I want to answer your questions, I really do. So I think that there were some in the chat. Should I go through, or Claire, did you?
I've been looking through them as they come in, so I can,
okay.
I can sum up.
Yeah, that would be great. I will, I'll stop sharing as well, so I can actually like look people in the face.
So yeah, so one question was asking about your statistic about how many officers there are per citizen earlier on. And they was saying, does that mean that there are 1 out of 3 people in the US are law enforcement?
I mean, not quite, because it's 2.17 or something like that. So the rate's like 2.17. So it's a lot. The total number was like, I mean, it's, and I think it's rate per adult. I don't think it includes children and stuff too. So I have to go back and double check that stat. But really the growth was more of the purpose of that. So the rate used to be 2.42, and in less than, or about 20 years, it's gone down almost half a point, which is a lot. Like that's the growth of a lot of law enforcement in a time where generally crime has been going down. So that's a pretty sort of telling, I think, bit of information. So,
one note just as I go through the chat, if anybody has a question that you'd like to ask out loud, please feel free to unmute yourself and jump in and ask in the usual way. But I can keep reading the ones that are coming in on the chat as well. So we've got another one asking about what the crime rate by race is compared to incarceration by race. If there's any correlation between those two.
So the funny thing, I was thinking about this because I realized that I didn't have a good sort of beginning statistic for the crime rate. But then I realized, the more I thought about it, we actually don't know what the crime rate technically is, because all we know is what the reported crime rate is, right? Many crimes occur that don't even get to that first sort of piece of the system, which is, the detection of the crime. So lots and lots of crime occurs. So I think it's even a sort of a misunderstanding of the system to even look at, say, like arrests versus incarceration. Because again, even getting to the point of arrest, which really would be the first kind of way you could measure crime existing, has already been through 2 really big steps in the process that involve people and human decisions. So that's kind of why I like the victimization stats, because that there doesn't even need to be an arrest there, right? Because I could report a crime, and if nobody's ever arrested for it, the crime still occurred because I'm reporting that it happened, but there will never be an arrest for it, and there'll never be an incarceration for it. So we really have no idea how much crime actually happens, because so much has to occur institutionally, and even to get us to the point where either somebody's arrested or that decision to arrest has even been made. I mean, you can think about that, especially in terms of like sexual assault, which we know is a hugely underreported crime. So, the best we can do is kind of look at the victimization numbers, on which there are pretty good statistics, and then kind of extrapolate from there. But I would be hesitant to even kind of make that comparison.
Sort of building on what you were talking about the sort of the decision to arrest, the decisions given to cops at the beginning of this whole process. And someone was wondering if there are any differences based on like the race of the cop, when the race of the police officer and the race of the suspect are different, or if they're the same, right? Like if a Black cop is working with a white suspect, or vice versa, or if a white cop is working with a white suspect.
That information may exist. I don't want to quote numbers that I don't know off the top of my head. That's not something I've looked into extensively. The difficulty I think with that is that often police work together in pairs, and so you might not, unless you were working with sort of same race pairs of cops, there might be kind of a difference in the way some of that was kind of working itself out. So some of those numbers I'm sure probably do exist, but I don't want to claim anything I don't know for sure. So
for sure.
But again, there are always, we don't see, we see officers of color involved in, again, police brutality and shootings and things of that nature, maybe not at the same rates, but they're certainly not immune from it.
I had to say, I was really struck by the statistics that you gave about like how often mental illness tends to impact arrest and incarceration rates. And somebody also asked about that, which is what kind of statistics are there about prisons sort of filling in for psych services? How like our criminal justice system sort of fills in for a lack of mental health services.
Yeah, I think that's something that really is probably is kind of just starting to be studied now. I don't think there's a lot of information out there, especially because one of the things you realize when you look at a lot of this stuff is not only state by state deals, with law enforcement so differently, but even like within Georgia, right? Like county by county, some of these decisions are so particular to localities. It's it's really hard to to kind of collect anything uniformly. Like even the Bureau of Justice Statistics, everything that they post has giant asterisks on it because every place does things so differently. When I was looking at those public defender statistics, it was like 49 states have public defenders offices, and I was like, wait, there's a state that doesn't have public defenders? And it's Maine, because Maine's public defender system is to rotate it out amongst like regular working attorneys. So they don't have like a state system, they just have this rotating group of, sort of private attorneys who take on indigent defense. So everything is done so very differently. We're just starting to see some law enforcement agencies experimenting with, I know they're doing it in DeKalb actually, experimenting with having a mental health counselor do like ride-arounds and be on call for shifts for officers who feel like they're being called to a mental health crisis as opposed to sort of a criminal situation. So I think there's going to be a lot more of that going forward, but right now, I don't think there's enough information out there, or as far as I know, nobody's done a really good kind of concerted study on how that's going. But I also think there hasn't been as much awareness of that even as an issue until much more recently. So.
This is a question that's coming out of maybe news from today, which is about private prisons. So someone wanted to know how the establishment of private prisons have affected incarceration rates.
So interestingly, And I used to be one of these people who was like, private prisons, blah. They actually incarcerate far fewer people than you would expect. And I actually was reading today, after this, this executive order that came out today, and everybody was praising it. And then I follow, if you're interested in criminal justice stuff at all, Josie Duffy Rice, who works for The Intercept, is amazing. And I follow her on Twitter and listen to her. She also has a really good podcast, again, if you're interested in criminal justice stuff. And she said that the executive order today is going to affect approximately 1% to 2% of federal prisoners, and that's it. Because most people who are in federal prison are in immigration detention. So like there's not a lot of federal prison that actually happens outside of things like immigration detention. So I mean, again, obviously the president can only do so much and only really has a lot of control over things at the federal level. But yeah, no, apparently federal private prisons are, affect about 1% to 2% of federal inmates. So, there haven't been a lot of long-term studies done on private prisons because there's not too much super long-term actually to really even look at, since it's a sort of a newer thing. But from what I've read, there's not much difference. Honestly, we love to incarcerate people, and it doesn't really matter where.
This is another question that's interesting. It says, why does white collar financial crime go to civil courts instead of criminal courts? And I don't think I knew that happened.
It doesn't always, but often what happens is because of the decision not to prosecute it happens most of the time, where it ends up in is civil court because it has like victims who decide to pursue it in civil court. So you think about like, I mean, like Bernie Madoff was the exception, I think, really, because it was such a blatant, and because it affected a lot of high status people, there was a really big call to to get him prosecuted at a criminal level. But I would say for the most part, it ends up in civil court because it ends up with either the company doesn't want to press charges because they don't want the publicity, right? So if you've been, embezzling from your company for, 20 years and they figure it out, and, they don't want it to get out that they've allowed somebody to embezzle from them for 20 years, right? So they're going to not pursue it criminally, but maybe, because nobody ever hears about civil court cases, right? Maybe they'll pursue it in civil court for damages or, or whatever they can kind of get out of it. But again, prosecutors don't, this is the other thing that we have to realize, is that so many prosecutors are elected, which is banana cakes and probably shouldn't happen. In my opinion, shouldn't happen, but prosecutors don't get reelected on white collar crime cases. Like, you're not going to get reelected to be a prosecutor by being like, I'm super hard on white collar crime. No, it's not going to happen, right? Like, I don't care about robberies. What I really want is, like, who cares about those murders? But, that embezzlement won't stand. So you're not going to be, you're not going to be prosecutor of the year by aggressively pursuing white collar crime cases, because again, people see money as an intangible. And also, not to be too cynical, but I think people see a lot of white collar crime as really being quite entrepreneurial, and think that if they could get away with it, they would do the same thing. Like, white collar crime is definitely if I could get away with it, I would do it kind of a crime. So I think that just people kind of care less about it because it doesn't affect them. And also because if you embezzled $20 million from, I don't know, AT&T, like, good. They probably, like, you've probably been slaving away, for $45,000 a year for them for the last 20 years. So good for you for getting yours from, big evil corporation, right? Like, we just don't care. We just don't care about it as much. And so it's just not on our radars, I think.
Yeah, I actually, sort of related to that, I've often found like in voting for prosecutors or for judges on a local level that it's really, really hard to find information about how they tend to rule. And I often find myself sort of relying on the word of other people, right? Which I don't always love to do. So I'm
Right.
wondering if you have any suggestions for resources to sort of be more aware of like the behavior of local judges or something like that, so we can vote more in a more informed way.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that is really you kind of can't know, right? Because a lot of it's not, is not public knowledge. And really, the thing is, honestly, most of the time, maybe it's not as much the case here, but in most places, also prosecutors run unopposed. So it's not even a case of like, oh, I really have to, make this decision. It's like this dude, again, this guy in the Curtis Flowers case is just a trip and a half. But I mean, this guy was, the prosecutor in this county in Mississippi and had been for 30 years. Literally, no one ever ran against him ever in all of the times that he was reelected. Even in the midst of him being brought to the Mississippi Supreme Court for egregious racial bias in jury selection on 3 different occasions, when the Mississippi Supreme Court said, why, yes, there was egregious racial bias in your jury selection, I'm overturning the case. And this was, pretty public, and nobody ever ran against him. So like, what were the people in that county in Mississippi supposed to do? So I mean, in a lot of places also they run on party, which is bizarre and contrary. So I mean, obviously you can vote on party if that's a thing that that feels good to you, because you can make assumptions about somebody's stance. But again, I think anything you're going to find is going to be what they release publicly, and very few people are secure enough to take the risk to say things like, I want to start a post-conviction unit because I want to review old cases, or I don't believe in the death penalty in a death penalty state, or things of that nature. So because like any other politician, they're trying to get elected, I'm not sure how much how much faith you can have. The best you can do is likely look at any high profile cases they've had, and see what the outcomes were. But again, so much of it happens behind the scenes. So if you already have a prosecutor who's in office, they're making these decisions every single day in conjunction with the police as to whether to charge or whether to not charge. And again, as soon as you make the decision not to charge, like it disappears into the ether, like it never happened. So you're really missing, again, 95% of what they've done is not transparent to anyone, because that all happens behind the scenes. And if they've pled stuff out or they've let it go, I mean, technically they can say they've won stuff, right? You plead something out, the prosecutor has technically won because they've achieved a conviction. So your conviction rate looks amazing because 95% of your cases are going to plead out. That's nuts. So
yeah. And Diane made
Diane made clear enough about that. It's very broken.
Thank you. That was great. Diane also made a good point that county sheriffs are also a really big part of these, and that people don't pay much attention to those elections as well.
And how could you know? I mean, what could you, as an average person, reliably know about the way, someone who, and especially when you're talking about the person who's running against the incumbent, right? At least somebody who's already been in office, you can see their record and you have said, but, if you're a deputy sheriff, right? How am I going to have any knowledge of, what kind of an officer you are, what you believe in, what your, what your stance is, how are you different from the guy who's already in office? I mean, I think that while I'm obviously very much in favor of democracy, I think that there are some decisions that actually don't need to be in our hands, that should be in experts' hands. because I think the positions are too important to either let party get in the way if you are in a place where any of these things are based on party. I think it's too important for that. And I think that even as a very well-informed citizen, I don't have the kind of information that I would need, you know, to really, really make those decisions. So that's, I don't know, I'm just against it. I also come from a state where that was like never a thing. So when I moved to a state where I had to start voting for judges and sheriffs and stuff, I was like, what the? Someone make this decision for me. I don't know what that's supposed to be. So.
Good. Awesome. I think I got to all the questions in the chat. Are there any people who have something on their minds, burning questions that you want to ask before we wrap up?
Thank you all so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you all being here and sticking around and asking questions and stuff. And like I said, we'll make the slides available because I know it was just tons of numbers that I threw at your head, and you might want to look them over a little bit more closely. And again, I really, like I said, if you're into this kind of stuff, I highly encourage going to some of those sites that I posted at the end, because a lot of them have a lot of really good sort of informative graphics and places that you can kind of click around and dig into things that might be of more personal interest to you. So I definitely highly recommend that. And the Justice in America podcast is a really is an incredibly good podcast if you're that breaks down each piece of the system and talks about the issues with it, kind of like piece by piece by piece. I actually learned a lot of this stuff just from listening to that podcast, and then kind of going forward and doing my own investigation post that. But they break stuff down really easily.
And then I did forget to mention that Hildegard put in the chat the name of the podcast about Curtis Flowers, which is In the Dark.
Yes, thank you.
If anybody's interested in that.
In the Dark. It's such a good podcast.
Thank you, Hildegard.
Yes, I couldn't think of the name of it. I was like picturing it on my iPod in my brain, but I couldn't. And that whole team, they do amazing. They've done such amazing stuff. So even the first season of it was incredible as well. The Curtis Flowers stories just happened to kind of be happening as it was happening too, which was really interesting.
Oh, wow.
But yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, Andrea, thank you so much. This was so informative. We really, really appreciate you coming back.
Anytime.
Thank you, Andrea. It was great. Yeah. So much information.
Very helpful.
Very full, very wonderful.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it's good.
Yeah. And we're done like right exactly at 9 o'clock. So that is so good.
I got through it all. To run there towards the end, but I get through it.
And thank you, Claire.
Yes, thank you, Claire, so much.
I'll just really quickly plug before everybody leaves the Community of Covenants 2-part series that's starting next week. And then if you think anybody would be interested in watching a replay of this, that will be at 5 p.m. on Sunday. So we'll let them know to come by. I'll be there and we can watch Andrea say really smart things again. Awesome. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.